But it's still considered a best practice. So is this sustainable, or do we expect next CBA to have that discussion again, to reinstate 4-packs?
Assembly Member Whittleton, through the chair, we did eliminate the minimum staffing requirement for 4-packs, which drove our staffing model. And we changed it to where we now, because we're adding the additional ambulances, we'll have the same number of people available to respond. They're just staffing different ambulances. In the perfect world, I need about 60 more people, and we would love to have 4-packs on every apparatus, enough people staffing for every single ambulance, and a really good cushion for to cover overtime and vacancies. So I can't say that you won't get this question in the future. It may happen because we could, best practices and looking how other departments are staffed, we could definitely use more emergency responders. For right now, this is definitely sustainable with our current staffing that we have, and in the future, as long as we maintain the minimum number of people, if we continue our hiring cycle and replace attrition, we should be able to sustain this.
Thanks.
Further questions for Chief Hedrick? Yeah, Mrs. Knapp.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Chief. In the work session, you had shared some numbers, or maybe Mr. Falsey did with us, about fire calls versus EMS, and I think for 2017 it was like 785 fire calls versus around 25,000 EMS or so. And one question that came up from constituents is, where can they find this data? Is it available to the public as far as the breakout of calls? Is that on the maps on the webpage, or?
Assemblymember LaFrance, through the chair, we actually have 2 locations you can find that. If you go to our website, you can see historical data in our annual reports, which are actually a biannual report every 2 years. It's posted on the front page of our website. And the GIS, if you go to the municipality's GIS system, if you look under fire, the little icon fire truck on it, if you click on that, it will give the numbers. And all that information is there. And people are always, feel free to call. We can give it to you by fire station, district. We can break down the numbers pretty extensively.
Thank you.
Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chief, so this is sort of similar to, actually, no, it's distinct from John's question. So if this becomes a new paradigm going forward, will it change any of our thoughts on replacing and purchasing apparatuses on future bonds? Like, there are a couple of engines, I believe, or at least one engine being replaced this year on the bond. I assume that we would get different kinds of usage out of these different personnel. Is there a chance that it will impact the kind of replacement schedule we have for some of our larger apparatuses?
So Assemblymember Dunbar, through the chair. Currently, our fire apparatus are they're on a schedule that's time related. They are on the front line for 20 years, and the national standard is actually 15 unless you have a very well-run operation maintenance system. We have, our maintenance shop does a fantastic job with our apparatus, so we're allowed a 5-year cushion to keep our apparatus in frontline status. So we keep our fire apparatus on the line, front lines, for 20 years. Then we move them to reserve for another 5 years, to where they substitute if we take a vehicle, if it gets wrecked, if we take a vehicle out of service for maintenance or some other thing, then we bring a reserve apparatus in. So we keep these apparatus for 25 years. Then they are donated or sold at auction, and they are usually pretty beat up at that point. It is not mileage based. However, because of the changes and basically reforming the department to where we have a little bit more focuses on EMS, we will be increasing the number of ambulance replacements. So typically we have done 1 year where we want to replace 3, and then 3 years of 2. Now we'll have to go to 3 each year because we'll have more ambulances. We're going from a model where we were using 9 ambulances, then we went to 11 ambulances, now we're going to have 13 ambulances. And unfortunately, we did not, because we didn't anticipate that we would be adding 2 ambulances this year to the fleet, so we didn't ask for new ambulances. So we're keeping 2 reserve ambulances we're turning them into frontline ambulances when they're already kind of past their prime. An ambulance typically lasts 7 years within our system, and with anywhere from 150 to 180,000 miles on them. Granted, they get good, preventive maintenance, and they're in as best shape as they could be, but we beat them up pretty good because they get driven a lot. So you may see in the future an increase in the number of ambulances we're bonding for. However, I say that may happen. Our plan is to start reboxing ambulances. So we're very happy with the current box model we're using, the box on the back and the layout and how it works for patient care. So in the future, we're going to start rechassing, and we're just going to change out, because that's where all the miles go. We're on the motor, the engine, the drivetrain, on that part of the ambulance, and the box itself lasts pretty good. So there is a company, the company that we buy our ambulances from, Braun Northwest, most recently, they have a program that we send them the used ambulance, they spruce it up, clean up the inside, make any of the minor changes that we need, and put it on a new chassis, much less expensive. So that's the format that we're planning on going to get the price of the ambulances down. So in the future, the box may have, maybe a 14-year-old box, but it'll have a, 7-year-old chassis under it.
Thank you. I guess that's a brief follow-up, Mr. Chair. I understand why we would have to replace the ambulances faster because of the mileage. It does disturb me a little bit that we replace engines not on a mileage basis. And I understand 20 years is a long time, it is, and there probably are software or other kind of innovations. But if you have a well-maintained truck from 20 years ago, even from 35 years ago, there are plenty of F-150s that run, right? And that isn't being used heavily. And I think that we are hoping to not use our, right, we want to send an ambulance out, not an engine out, right? And so I don't know if you're constrained by some kind of federal law, actually, or if it's just a standard, but the engines and the other large apparatuses are extremely expensive. If there's anything we can do to replace them a little bit less often, assuming that they aren't getting heavy use, I would be in favor of that.
So, Assemblymember Dunbar, through the chair, it's great when we can keep an apparatus for 20 to 25 years. You are correct, some of them don't have as many miles as, say, an engine at downtown Station 1. They put a lot of miles on their equipment. It is the technology changes that force some of that, and we do, because we have an effective maintenance program, we're able to keep this equipment up and running for so long. But if you look at a 25-year-old apparatus, the safety features that are built in new apparatus, those 25-year-old apparatus don't have those. Our new apparatus have airbags and better seats. They're better ergonomically fit for our employees, so it's a better work environment. They also carry some features that we don't have in our older apparatus, such as a water line that will pull off of it for decon. Compartment space is different. Eventually things wear out, everything from compartment doors to seat belts, and eventually you get to the point where we're spending so much time in rehabbing and maintaining and replacing all those old items, it isn't cost effective.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Trainee.
None related to this, just a question for you. I'm getting complaints from some people that they go to Fred Meyer, Cars, some of the stores like that, and they're locking the doors down because of security reasons. Would you make sure they're meeting the minimum fire requirements for access coming out? Had one lady complain, she says, if there was a fire alarm, I wouldn't know where to go out because he had the doors blocked.
So, Assemblymember Trainee, through the chair, we actually, our fire prevention unit, Fire Marshal Hill and company, went and met with all of the major big box store retailers. They were using the locked doors as a, basically shoplifting prevention measure. They met with them, and they all had to develop some type of program so that wouldn't be happening, and signage was supposed to be improving. Anytime you hear that, please have them contact our fire prevention office so we can immediately go and make sure that they are meeting the requirements that we laid down for them. Because they all guaranteed that they would follow these rules, and when they're not, unless we happen to be in the store and see that, we rely on citizens to let us know if they're really complying or not.
Well, thank you. She called a couple times complaining. She went to one store, and they put grocery carts to block access going out. And what they should have is some way to at least notify the public. At night, this door is locked for security. but this, in case of emergency, this door's open.
Yeah,
Because I don't
they're
want
not-
people dying because they couldn't get out of the building.
Absolutely, and we will stay on top of that really. As soon as we hear about those kind of things, they immediately go and meet with the manager.
Okay, thank you, Matt.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Constant.
Thanks. Coming back to the ambulances and the four-pack question. So the four-pack isn't a requirement, it's a standard that we try to achieve. And I'm imagining now, so the compromise that's being made here is we won't have four, but we'll have more ambulances or mobile ICUs. What happens in the case of another Summer of Spice when all of our NICUs are in one place and then we have an incident somewhere? Is it then the engines and other equipment will show up in force? Or what's the plan for that?
Assemblymember Constant, through the chair, we have not changed our way of responding that fire engines won't go on medical calls. Fire engines, because those are trained emergency medical personnel who will respond on those calls, we send the closest apparatus. So it may be an engine. This gives us more transport capability in the case, so we have had that happen, and it's not just a Spice thing. We've had motor vehicle crashes. You know, we had Snowpocalypse a couple years ago where we still occasionally run out. Now we have 2 additional ambulances in service that will help cover that gap. We always have the capability of asking our mutual aid partners, J-Bear, Girdwood, and Chuyak, to send us an ambulance if we need more transport capability. But our fire apparatus and our tenders, fire engines and fire trucks will still be responding to medical calls.
Just the other way, this is my question really. So your four-pack isn't about an EMS response, it's about a fire response. And so if we're not running the four-pack and we're running more of the mobile ICUs and they all get tied up, operationally, is there no difference then on the fire response, or how does that work?
No, so for EMS response with a fire apparatus, I think I'm understanding is we, on all of our apparatus, minimum staffing is 3 people, except for tenders. So those 3 people all have EMS certifications. If they go to an EMS related call, they can perform care. It is sometimes nice if there's a 4th person there to help with that care. So on the EMS side of it, 3-pack, 4-pack doesn't have as big of and it doesn't change things as much. And fortunately, with our current staffing, even though we're EMS centric now, we don't guarantee that we'll have as many 4-packs as we used to. That's not what our minimum staffing is based on. We will still have the majority of our apparatus, quite often we'll have 4 people on them because of the 1-to-1 ratio. You work 3 shifts on an ambulance, there's someone that you trade off with, and you then work 3 shifts on a fire apparatus, while basically it's kind of like job sharing.
Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, part of my question got answered with the mutual aid agreement with the base and the volunteer fire departments. 2 questions. Has this city ever had a private ambulance service?
Assemblymember Dyson, through the chair, we do have private ambulance services that are responsible for interfacility and scheduled transports that are not emergency related. They do not, private ambulance in Anchorage does not respond to emergency medical calls. It's all pre-scheduled. They need medical care, but it's not a 911 call. It has been looked at multiple times, and most of the private ambulance vendors are not interested because they wouldn't make any money.
All right.
Yeah, it's not
answered
cost
that
effective.
question. So back to the homeless issue and so on. There was something in the press here a few months ago about medical response people being hassled and having some issues around going to some areas of the city. Was that ever an issue, and is it still?
Assemblymember Dyson, through the chair, we did have some concerns. Things down on 3rd Avenue along that corridor, it was getting a little rough down there, and we put measures in place to make sure that we didn't just send a single ambulance crew with 2 people down there. So we made sure and send another crew, and we worked strongly with APD to make sure that we were looking out for them, they were looking out for us, and we resolved those. Since we put some parameters in place, we have not had that issue anymore.
Could you estimate what extra it costs us to provide the service, given those risks to our personnel?
Assemblymember Dyson, through the chair, I don't know if we could put we have not run those numbers, so I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. It's staffing that's already available and ready for response. It just takes them away from other duties and being available for other emergencies.
But the other duties don't affect service to the population in general?
It could, if that continued, so I think we got a handle on it pretty well. If it would have continued, it would have hampered our training, maintaining our training requirements and things like that.
Yeah, all right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further questions? Thank you, Chief Hedrick. Any further discussion on this item? We had a work session on it, but you ready for the vote? It's like we're there, but we're going to do it with a roll call. Members may proceed to vote. Madam Clerk?
Mr. Croft?
Yes.
Mr. Rivera?
Yes.
Mr. Constant?
Yes.
Mr. Dunbar?
Yes.
Mr. Trainee?
Yes.
Mr. Dyson?
Yes?
Mr. Weddleton?
Yes.
Ms. LaFrance?
Yes.
Ms. Wentz?
Yes.
9-0, Mr. Chair.
Item passes 9-0. It's the only item on our agenda that brings us to audience participation. If there any audience participation, Mr. Hagerman.
My name is Eugene Cohen-Haberman. I represent myself. I follow Public Cross. I live in Axis Valley. When Public Cross is done appropriately, decision made by the governing body is more like a public interest. I want to stay on topic, particularly what we're dealing with right now, and not go off topic. I did appreciate some of the member trainees' recognition of the situation, and I'd like to give more detail concerning the stores like Fred Meyer's. Remember, these are only two entrances coming in and out. They have a long, and specifically like Fred Meyer's. I was at Fred Meyer's store last night on the way back to the Anchorage Community Council meeting, okay? And I'm also familiar with Fred Meyer's and what they do out in the valley, and it's consistent. Around 8 o'clock at night, approximately, they shut down one of those stores. Near the liquor store is generally where they do it. And that means, for example, and think about the length of walking. People generally park where they think they're going to do shopping and don't have to go through the whole long length of the store. And we're talking about accessibility. And so for me, I was I went in I was forced to go in one entrance, walk all the way down, because those are long stores, and then come back because of that restriction of only one door into any store. And that's what's going on. And to me, I think there's an issue of not just safety, but accessibility, and what it's doing to people, and particularly people who need to be closer, and what's the whole premise of the laws that deal with accessibility handicap as far as having parking spaces close to the store. This is what's happening. So personally, yesterday, Anchorage store, but it's also happening in the valley. And then in closing, I'm still on the same subject, but on the same issue you've been addressing, is the notice thing is, I saw, and you have two notices for this meeting, and one says from 1 to 1:15 for this meeting that you're having right now, and one says from 1 to 3, and that inconsistency is not good, okay? And they're on the site, and it's posted the same date, and so you need to have what we call consistency and not confuse the public, and that's all I have to say. And thank you very much. With 22 seconds to spare.
You don't have to take up the entire time. Any other audience participation? Seeing none, that was our sole item, so we're adjourned.